Linux Survival Guide, Part 2. In this part of the Linux Survival Guide, we will be discussing the pros and cons of using Windows software in Linux, using compatibility layers such as Wine, Crossover, and others such as Play on Linux, and then we will also look at virtual machines, and see which one will best suit you. Before we begin this video, if you have not seen my last Linux Survival Guide video, please do so now. It will greatly help you understand this video. This is a follow-up to the original Linux Survival Guide video. I also have a Linux Migration Guide series which I encourage you to check out, if you're interested in moving from Windows or Mac OS over to Linux. So, what brings the need for Windows software on Linux? Some migrating Windows users find it frustrating when their existing software does not support Linux, or the free and open source alternative or equivalent is not as good as the proprietary application, so they need some viable way of being able to use it without running into significant problems. Meet Wine, a compatibility layer which translates Windows apps into POSIX-compatible apps. Wine essentially allows for Windows apps and games to communicate with your Linux system. I will put it to you like that. Wine has been around for over 25 years, and it has greatly improved upon itself since its initial release all those years ago. Wine is renowned for having great emulation capabilities, a very customizable and configurable Windows environment, and it can also run older games that were made for Windows back in the day. So Wine does have some useful features and functionality. However, it won't run every single bit of Windows software out there, especially software which needs access to port, processing power, graphics power, etc. Wine is sadly very limited and often not the best solution for running such software, but for basic to intermediate programs, you should be able to run it under Wine just fine. Unfortunately, Wine has a lot of downsides as well, one of them being that it is not intuitive for beginners and noobs, since you must install Wine via the command line. Using the terminal can prove to be a daunting experience, but it is often necessary to accomplish certain tasks on a Linux system. However, since most people moving to Linux will not want to use the terminal, using Wine might not be the best way to run your needed Windows software. Another downside is that Wine is not the Swiss Army knife to run all your needed Windows apps. As mentioned earlier, the more resource-intensive an app is, the more likely it is to fail to work properly under compatibility layers. Even the Windows version of 7-zip fails to work under Wine, and 7-zip is so darn basic you would not think it would fail to run inside a compatibility layer, but it does. So don't have high expectations with Wine being able to run intensive or demanding applications. If some basic stuff won't work in it, how the hell do you expect power-intensive apps to work under such things? Wine is not perfect, unfortunately. Many of its issues plague its usability and hinders its ability to do what it says it will do on the box. So what other ways can I run Windows software inside of Linux, you may be asking yourself? Look no further than a virtual machine, VM. Virtual machines are what they sound like, a virtual computer running inside your host OS. A VM can be a convenient way to run many operating systems at once, or to test out others such as Linux. It also offers you a way of retaining access to legacy systems such as Windows XP, so if you need old Windows software and that software won't work on later versions, you could install a copy of XP and have it up and running in less than an hour. Virtual machines also provide Linux and Mac users a convenient way to access and use their needed Windows software, because much of what is made for Windows rarely ever gets ported over to Mac OS, Linux, and other systems, so you may not have much other choice other than to use that application, as you may not be able to find a suitable alternative which can accomplish the same tasks. So a virtual machine is also like a compatibility layer of sorts. But this method is also easier and more intuitive for beginners and noobs, because you're interacting with a familiar environment, not using something that's totally unfamiliar and somewhat daunting. However, a VM also has a fair number of downsides, but we'll get to those in just a minute. VMs are also a safe way to test software without running the risk of infecting your main operating system. So if you're unsure of a website or app being safe, a VM can be a safeguard method you use to prevent any possible malware execution on your real system. However, the VM must not be sharing folders, clipboard, and you must disable access to USB port, to make things as compartmentalized and isolated as possible. Otherwise you run the risk of compromising your main computer, and you won't even be aware that the malware has infected your real system. So if you do decide to do malware testing, or you just want to test an app or website you're not sure is safe, please be very careful when doing so, as a VM is not 100% immune to compromises either, and if your host OS is not secure, a VM will not help in the slightest to adding better security. The main downsides to using virtual machines are that they cannot always run your needed software and games, and while things such as GPU pass-throughs exist, there is almost no point in doing such things, because now you're just jumping through unnecessary hoops to use your already functional Windows software which would work straight out of the box on a Windows system, so there is absolutely no point doing a GPU pass-through on Linux. It defeats the purpose of using Linux for starters, because you're not embracing Linux for what it is, you're relying on Windows one way or another, so why switch to Linux if all you're gonna do is use Windows inside of Linux? It's stupid, a waste of time and effort, and you're just complicating simple things by jumping through several hoops. Virtual machines can only run on computers with capable and powerful enough hardware. You need a computer with at least 8 GB of RAM, and an SSD would greatly boost performance of the virtual machine. So if you do intend on using a VM in Linux a lot of the time, be sure your computer is capable of running them first. Finally, a virtual machine does not offer near-native performance, so anything you run inside of it will not perform anywhere near as good as it would on bare metal, regardless of the host operating system you're using to run virtual machines. So don't be disappointed if an app freezes, crashes, or performs poorly. You're asking for such problems when you rely on such methods to run Windows apps in Linux. While Wine and virtual machines are a great way to retain access to Windows software, they are also not the best solution. Both defeat the purpose of using Linux because you're not embracing Linux. You're relying on the software you've been using for the longest time, and as sad as it might be to ditch that software, sometimes you must do it, as Linux will not run a good chunk of your needed programs, unless you're like me and you use a good chunk of free and open source software which natively works on Linux. And it's better to adjust to using Linux native apps rather than constantly battling with Wine or virtual machines to get your needed Windows software working properly. In the next part of the Linux Survival Guide, we will be taking a look at some great productivity software which can easily replace proprietary software such as Microsoft Office, Adobe Photoshop, etc. So stay tuned for that video. Please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. See you next video. Bye for now.